The steam from the pressing iron had turned my palms pink by noon, which was always how I knew it was going to be a slow Tuesday. Claudette's alterations had been on Birch Street for 31 years. I'd been working there for 4 of them, which made me the newest employee, and also, since Claudette's daughter had moved to Phoenix and her son never showed any interest, the one who handled everything from hem repairs to the deep clean of antique wedding gowns. The work was quiet and precise and mine. I was 24 years old, no degree, but I could hand-finish a buttonhole so clean it looked machine-done, and I could press a dress shirt without leaving a single ghost crease. That counted for something. Birch Street was the kind of block that people in the newer parts of the city didn't know existed. There was Al's Hardware on the corner, which still smelled like pine shavings and WD-40. There was Rosario's Deli 2 doors down, where the sign had been faded since before I was born. Mr. Babcock ran the used bookshop at the far end, and he brought Claudette a coffee every single morning without being asked. Because that was just the kind of street it was. I didn't have much outside of it. My apartment was a 12-minute walk away. The rent was $790 a month. I'd arranged my entire life so that nothing required more than I could carry on my own. That was how I wanted it, or at least, that was what I told myself. The bell above the shop door jangled at 2:47 on a Thursday, and Claudette appeared from the back, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looking like a woman who had just received news she'd been half expecting and didn't like any better for it. "The building's been sold," she said. I set down the jacket I was steaming. "What?" "The whole block. Not just us, Al, Rosario, Babcock, all of us. I got the letter this morning. New owner, some development company. Morrow Group, LLC. She said the name like it tasted wrong. They want to schedule walkthroughs next week." I stood there with the steam iron still hissing in my hand. What does that mean for the shop? Claudette pulled her glasses down to her nose and looked at me over them. "It means we don't know yet. Could mean nothing. Could mean everything." She went back into the stockroom. I finished the jacket, but my hands weren't steady anymore. The Morrow Group sent someone on a Monday. The man named Silas Morrow himself, which surprised everyone. We'd all expected a junior associate with a clipboard and a rehearsed smile. Instead, we got him, tall, late 30s, wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that had clearly been made for his specific measurements and no one else's. He moved through the front of the shop with a controlled ease that only came from years of practice. The kind that looked like calm, but was actually something more watchful. Claudette met him at the door. I stood behind the counter, pretending to sort through a rack of tagged garments, which was what I always did when I needed to observe, without looking like I was observing. "Mr. Morrow," Claudette said, her voice carrying that particular quality, too even, too pleasant. That meant she was nervous and refusing to show it. "Thank you for seeing me." His voice was lower than I expected, not performatively deep, just unhurried. He glanced around the shop, the pressed garments hanging in neat rows, the antique sewing cabinet along the east wall, the framed photograph of Claudette's mother standing in front of the original sign from 1993. He looked at the photograph longer than people usually did. "Can I offer you anything?" Claudette asked. "I'm fine, thank you." Then he turned and looked directly at me. I had not introduced myself. I hadn't made a sound, and yet he looked at me like he'd known I was there the whole time. "This is Dara," Claudette said. "She runs the pressing and the specialty work." "Dara," he said, "just that." I nodded, said nothing, kept my face neutral in the way I'd learned to keep it neutral. Not from rudeness, just from years of being underestimated, and deciding I'd rather surprise people than reassure them. He held my gaze for 1/2 second longer than necessary. Then he turned back to Claudette and began asking questions about the lease. He came back 3 days later. Claudette was at her dentist appointment. I was alone, which technically the shop was closed at 6, but I stayed in until 7 most nights, because the work was better done without interruption. I had a silk evening gown on the dress form that needed hand-stitching along a busted seam, and I'd put on the small Bluetooth speaker I kept on a shelf above the work table, and I was doing what I sometimes did when I was alone, singing quietly to whatever was playing, barely above a whisper, just enough to keep my own company. I didn't hear him come in. The bell above the door didn't ring because the latch hadn't caught. It did that sometimes. I didn't notice. I was focused on the seam, and I was singing, and then I looked up, and he was standing just inside the threshold, with his hand still on the door handle. I stopped. He didn't move. The song finished playing. The next one started, something slow, old Motown, and the silence between us was filled with it. "I'm sorry," he said. He didn't look sorry. He looked like he'd seen something he hadn't expected and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I knocked. I don't think the bell caught. I set down the needle. We're closed. "I know. I left a jacket here last week, a charcoal canali, pickup number 44. I didn't realize I'd missed the window." I knew which jacket he meant. I'd been the one to press it. It was the kind of garment that made you understand why tailoring existed. Every seam exactly where it was supposed to be, the wool carrying a weight that didn't rush. I'd spent more time on it than the ticket required, because it seemed like the kind of thing that deserved the extra care. I went to the rack and found it without having to look hard. When I turned back, he was still watching me with the same expression he'd had at the door. Quiet, concentrated. "Nice work," he said when I handed it over. "You can't tell anything from the bag." "No," he agreed. He didn't argue with it. "But I can tell from the way you treated it, the way you're careful with things that don't belong to you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. He paid for the ticket and added cash for the after-hours trouble, which I tried to refuse, and which he set on the counter anyway. He put the jacket over his arm. He was halfway to the door when he stopped. "What were you singing?" he asked. I felt heat rise into my face and hated it. Nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was just something I do when I'm working alone. It's not. I stopped. It was Ain't No Mountain High Enough, the original Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. I know it's not. "It was good," he said simply. Then he left. I stood in the middle of the shop. For a long moment, my hands folded in front of me, the sound of Motown still playing on the little speaker, like nothing unusual had happened at all. The offer came the following Tuesday, delivered in person. He walked into the shop at noon and sat down in the customer chair across from my work table. I kept my hands on the hem I was turning. "I'm converting 2 of the buildings on this block," he said. "The plan has always been a boutique hotel, 12 rooms, no chain affiliation. But the ground floor is where I'm stuck. I don't want retail for retail's sake. I want something that belongs here, something that remembers what this street was." I looked up. "And you're telling me this because?" "Because I want you to run it." The room was very quiet. "I do alterations," I said. "You do a lot more than that, and you know it. You know every person who walks through this door. You know what they need before they say it. You know the difference between something worth saving and something that needs to be let go." He leaned forward slightly. "That's not alterations, Dara. That's hospitality." It was a good speech. The problem with good speeches is that they make you suspicious of the person giving them. "I have no management experience," I said. "I have people who can teach you management. I can't teach what you already have." I thought about the $790 rent. I thought about my dad's medical bills, which I'd been paying down in $200 increments for a year and a half. I thought about what it would mean to stop looking at my bank balance with one eye closed. "What happens to Claudette's shop?" I asked. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. "That's a fair question." "That's the only question." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm offering Claudette a buyout above market value and a right of first refusal on ground floor retail in the new building at below market rent for 3 years. She can continue the shop or she can retire. That's her choice to make, not mine." I looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. "I'll think about it," I said. "That's all I'm asking." Claudette told me to take the job. She said it in the same voice she used when she was correcting my technique. Direct. No cushioning, because cushioning was for people who needed to be protected from reality, and she'd never thought I was one of those. "You've been doing other people's work for 4 years, she said. "It's time to do your own." This would be his work. "Not if you do it right." She handed me a coffee the way she always did when the conversation was serious. He didn't get where he is by investing in things he didn't believe in. He's not offering you this out of sentiment. Then why is he? She looked at me like the answer was obvious. Because he can see what's there. Some people can, and most can't. She wrapped her hands around her mug. Don't you dare turn this down for my sake. My daughter in Phoenix has been asking me to come help her with the kids for 3 years. Maybe it's time. I signed the offer letter that Friday. The salary was $68,000 plus benefits, which was more than I'd made in the previous 4 years combined. I sat in my apartment afterward and read the number 3 times before I believed it. What followed was the most disorienting and the most alive I had ever felt at the same time. There was a woman named Patrice, who ran Silas's operations team and who didn't waste words or patience, and who I came to respect in the way you respected someone who expected more from you than you expected from yourself. There were late evenings in conference rooms going over layouts, sourcing, community programming. There were decisions I made that I didn't know I was capable of making. Silas was present for more of it than I expected. He had a way of listening that was different from most people's listening. He didn't wait for you to finish so he could say his thing. He actually heard you. And then he asked the question that went one layer below what you'd said. We ate dinner together twice, ostensibly to talk through the hotel's ground floor concept, what the space should feel like, who it should be for. Both times we ended up talking past the agenda, about the neighborhood and what it meant to build something that lasted, about what we'd each lost and rebuilt in the years before. He'd grown up in South Baltimore. Poor didn't quite cover it, he said, in the flat way people used when they'd made peace with a thing. He didn't romanticize it, he just named it. And you built all of this from that, I asked. Some of what I built, yes. Not all of the how. He turned his glass in his hand. I made choices early on that got me where I needed to go faster than the clean path would have. I've spent a long time since then trying to walk that back. I didn't push, but I heard it. The night everything changed, I was locking up the hotel space at 9 o'clock, doing a final walkthrough before the contractor crew returned in the morning. 2 men were waiting inside. They were professionally polite in the way that was scarier than anything loud. One stood near the door, the other did the talking. Mrs. Westbrook, he said, like he'd looked me up, like I was a file, we need you to give Mr. Morrow a message. I held my phone in my hand without looking at it. I'm not his assistant. No, but you're someone he'll listen to. He said it without heat. Tell him Keene sends his regards. Tell him the arrangement in Fells Point hasn't been forgotten. I said nothing. Tell him the people who helped him get where he is remember the terms, and that terms have a way of coming due. They left without touching anything, without raising their voices. That was somehow the worst part, how clean and ordinary it was. I stood in the unfinished lobby for 3 minutes before my hands worked well enough to dial. Silas answered on the second ring. I told him what happened in a single even sequence. Keene, Fells Point, the arrangement. The silence on his end was different from his usual silence, heavier, with a particular density that told me this wasn't news exactly, just a thing that had arrived earlier than he'd calculated for. Don't leave the building, he said. I'm sending someone. Who's Keene? I'll explain when I get there. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Who is Keene? A beat, then someone from before, someone I did business with when I didn't have other options. I thought that chapter was closed. What kind of business? Another beat, longer, the kind that moved faster than the legal kind, protection agreements, money through channels that weren't exactly registered. I paid it all back. I walked away clean, or I thought I did. I sat down on a painter's tarp draped over a sawhorse and pressed one hand flat on my knee. Fells Point? A deal I brokered 11 years ago. I cleared my end. He thinks I still owe him something I don't. He used me to send you a message, I said. He was in my building. He knew my name. I know, his voice was very quiet. Dara, I'm sorry. He arrived in 20 minutes. He came through the door and looked at me in the fluorescent light of the unfinished lobby, with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled watchfulness, not the measured intensity. Something that looked a great deal like fear. He sat down across from me on an upturned crate, elbows on knees, and told me the rest. He'd been 26 when he'd started taking money from Keene's organization to finance his first 2 properties in Baltimore. The returns were enough to go legitimate by year 3. He'd paid back every dollar with interest and walked. He'd spent 11 years building something entirely clean. But Keene was renegotiating old arrangements across the board. People who'd ever had a connection were being called in or leveraged, and now they'd found his connection to me. What does he want? I asked. A piece of the Birch Street project. Not money. Control. A percentage of the licensing structure that would give him cover for moving other funds through it. And if you say no, he makes my past public, the company loses its licenses, the projects collapse, and he makes himself inconvenient to anyone near me. He didn't say my name when he said that last part. He didn't have to. He took me home in silence. At some point, he handed me coffee from a thermos he kept behind the passenger seat, and I held it with both hands and stared out at the streetlights until I knew what I thought. You could pay him, I said finally. That's not how it ends. You pay once, you pay until there's nothing left to take. Then you go to the FBI, I said it quietly. You give them everything. Keene, the arrangement, Fells Point, the money flows, all of it. You cooperate fully. You take whatever deal they offer. He was very still. That's not a small thing, Dara. No. I turned to look at him. In the passing streetlight, his face was all shadow and angle, and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a thing for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. You lose the company, maybe. Or most of it. You pay fines. Maybe you spend time inside. But you come out the other side with your name attached to a choice you made, instead of a compromise you accepted. He looked at me for a long moment. You know what you're asking me to give up. Yes, I didn't look away, and I know what you keep. He didn't decide that night. He took 5 days, and I know because Patrice, who'd been briefed, who had her own opinions, and who communicated them in the manner of a woman who had watched this particular man make difficult decisions before, gave me quiet updates without being asked. On the 5th day, Silas called a former federal prosecutor he'd known for years, which told me that somewhere in the back of his mind he'd always known this conversation might come. The process took months. There were meetings I wasn't part of, documents I never saw, a period where Silas was hard to reach, and Patrice ran everything with the quiet efficiency of someone who had always known it might fall to her. Keene was arrested on charges including racketeering, extortion, and financial conspiracy. 3 other names came with him. Silas was charged with 2 counts, reduced to 1 through his cooperation. He was sentenced to 14 months in a minimum security federal facility in Western Maryland, fined more than I could calculate in my head, and placed on 2 years of supervised release after. I was in the courtroom the day they sentenced him. He didn't know I'd be there. When they let him out, he turned and found me in the gallery. Something happened to his face that I had never seen before, a loosening, like something held tightly for so long that the release of it was almost physical. He mouthed something. I was too far away to be certain, but I was fairly sure it was thank you. Patrice and I opened the hotel 9 months after his sentencing. We named it the Birch, 12 rooms, a small cafe on the ground floor, and a repair workshop tucked in the back. Alterations of all things. Claudette came back from Phoenix for the opening and stood in the middle of it with her hands on her hips and a look on her face that I decided meant approval. Mr. Babcock claimed a corner table in the cafe before we'd even officially opened, the same way he'd claimed his spot at the old bookshop, like he'd simply decided that was what the space was for. I sent Silas letters, once a month, sometimes more, the hotel's first booking. The morning a group of regulars from Rosario's Deli started taking their lunch in our cafe without being invited, just drifting over because it felt like the same place somehow. Small things, neighborhood things. He wrote back. His letters were short and very direct, which was exactly how I expected them to be. He asked good questions. He noticed things in my descriptions that I hadn't quite noticed myself. Once he wrote, "You make ordinary things sound like they matter. I mean that as a compliment. I'm not sure enough people tell you that." I read that one twice before I folded it back up. He walked out on a Tuesday in October, earlier than the original release date. I knew because Patrice told me, in that particular casual tone that meant she was telling me on purpose. I drove there myself, 2 hours south on 83, through the flat middle stretch of Maryland where the trees had just started to turn, and the sky was the specific gray that meant cold without rain. I parked outside the facility gate and waited. He came through the door at 10:14 in the morning. Thinner. His hair had grown out enough to change the shape of his face. He was carrying a single bag over one shoulder and wearing a jacket from the release wardrobe that did not fit him and looked honestly terrible. He saw me before I could decide whether to get out of the car. I got out of the car. We stood in the gravel lot with 8 feet between us, and neither of us said anything for a moment. That was fine. The silence between us had always been the kind that didn't need filling. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know. Patrice could have arranged a car." "I know that too." He looked at me with those dark, watchful eyes that noticed everything, and something in his expression settled, quietly, the way a room settles when the last person has finally found their seat. "The hotel," he said, not a question. "It's really good, Silas. I heard you started a monthly alterations workshop, teaching people to repair their own things." Claudette's idea. She zooms in from Phoenix for the first session of every month. The participants are mostly between 40 and 85, which is exactly the right demographic to not care about the learning curve. The corner of his mouth moved. "I want to see it." "You will." He crossed the 8 feet between us, and when he reached me, he lifted one hand and touched my face, briefly. The edge of his thumb along my cheekbone, the way someone touched something they'd been afraid of losing, and had kept afraid of losing for 14 months. "I've been calling you Songbird in my head the whole time," he said quietly. "It felt like you should know that." I laughed, and it came out more ragged than I intended, which meant it was real. "That's terrible," I said. "I know." I stepped forward and put my arms around him, and he held on the way people held on when they'd had a long time to think about what they'd do if they ever got the chance. On the drive back north, somewhere in the stretch where the highway widened and the tree line thickened on both sides, Silas asked me to stop at a diner, just a regular diner, vinyl booths, laminated menus, coffee that came in a glass pot and had clearly been sitting since early morning. He ordered eggs and ate slowly, looking out the window at the parking lot with the same expression he'd had the very first time he'd walked into Claudette's shop. That quiet attention to ordinary things, like they might mean something. The waitress refilled his cup without being asked, and he thanked her by name, because he'd read her name tag, because that was the kind of person he had decided to become. When she walked away, he looked at me across the table. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said. "The company is different now, smaller. Patrice has kept it intact, but there's real work ahead." "I know," she told me. "I want to do it differently this time." He wrapped his hands around the mug. "Build things that belong to the places they're in instead of just occupying them." He paused. "I think you've been doing that for 9 months without me. I'd like to learn from you." I held his gaze. "Silas, you owned the building first." "That's not the same as understanding what makes it a place." Outside, a car pulled out of the lot, and the sun caught the back window and threw a stripe of warm light across the table between us. Brief there and then gone. I thought about Birch Street, about Claudette's glasses pushed up on her forehead, about the bell above the door that didn't always catch, about the weight of a well-made jacket under my hands, and a song I'd only been singing, because I was sure no one was listening. Moments don't announce themselves. They just arrive, small and accidental, and the only thing you can do is notice them, and decide that they're worth something. I reached across the table and touched the back of his hand, lightly, the way you touched something you intended to keep. "Then we figure it out," I said. And that was how it started. Not with a grand declaration or a perfect moment, but with bad diner coffee and 14 months of letters and a man who had finally learned that the hardest choice was also the one that gave everything else room to grow. Some moments were accidental. Some were worth every single thing they cost. This one was both.